Hello, listeners. Welcome to Furs, Fins, and Feathers, a podcast presented by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I'm Parker.
And I'm Francis. In each episode, we will discuss a Wyoming wildlife species and the features that make it so incredible.
In the cold, clear waters of Wyoming, something sinister is lurking beneath the surface.
Smaller than your pinky nail and reproducing rapidly, we need to be on the lookout.
Brought in by unsuspecting visitors, these tiny invaders have found a home in Wyoming's lakes, rivers, and streams, and they're spreading.
If we don't stop their spread, soon they'll be everywhere. Normally, we talk about native Wyoming species, but this month we are highlighting an invasive threat to Wyoming's waters.
New Zealand mudsnails were introduced to Wyoming from, you guessed it, New Zealand.
Hey, you're not Francis.
That's true, Parker. I'm not Francis, as much as I aspire to be.
Stephanie, do you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Hey, listeners. So this is your Furs, Fins, and Feathers producer, Stephanie here. I am serving as co-host today because before I was producer extraordinaire, I was the aquatic invasive species specialist for Cheyenne for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. So I have a little bit of background in what we're going to be talking about today.
Stephanie's going to be our mud snails expert. And in case you forgot, here's how this works. Stephanie and I are going to rate this animal on a scale of 1 to 10 in a variety of categories. We then average our scores to get their wild rating. First up, mobility. It's how they move. I'm going to start New Zealand mudsnails off with a 1.
A 1?
Yeah, I want a womp womp.
You're getting a womp womp.
So they're very slow, and it's kind of a function of their size, but they can only travel 60 yards in like 3 months.
All right, that's a pretty long time to move that short of a distance.
Yeah, if they're going upstream. If they're going downstream, they can float much easier, but that's not really moving. That's just kind of like
going
riding.
with the flow.
Yeah, going with the flow. What did you give them?
I mean, they are snails, so I would expect them to be slow. So I gave New Zealand mudsnails a 7.
Strong start.
Very different than your 1.
Yeah.
And while I agree they don't move very fast themselves, they get a 7 for mobility because other people, humans, can transport them very easily and very quickly.
What do you mean?
So they came from New Zealand, right? And these tiny little snails did not swim across the entire ocean, crawl across half of the United States to get to Idaho, where we first found them. So they had to come in somehow. They were likely introduced through stocking of game fish. So people brought fish from New Zealand, and in that water and in those fish, there were snails, and they reproduced and spread all across the landscape. So they came here. We found them first in 1987, and since then, they've just started popping up in a lot of different places.
So are they in Wyoming?
They are. So they're found in multiple places in Wyoming. We first found them kind of in that Yellowstone area. And we don't think that they crawled across land or upstream to get to all these different places. So it's most likely that humans actually moved them from place to place.
So like what kind of gear would a human use? Like are they picking snails up and carrying them to rivers and dropping them off?
I mean, they could, but probably not. What they're probably doing is using things like fishing gear. So waders, whether they have different kinds of soles, whether rubber or felt, and the snails can then travel up into that gear, kind of get nestled up in there. And when people move that gear, if they don't clean it properly, those snails can kind of hitch a ride over to a new system.
Okay.
Now that we've talked about mobility, let's move on to size. Size is how big or how small, how short or how tall. We care about them all. And while I don't like New Zealand mudsnails, I really care about their size. I gave them a 9.
A 9?
A 9. And I know that's high, and you don't want to reward invasive species, but New Zealand mudsnails, their population size can be enormous. They can be in groups of up to 500,000 in a square meter. Do you know how big a square meter is?
I don't, because I'm an American and I speak in yards. How big are we talking about in terms of like feet, yards, inches?
It's like 3 feet by 3 feet.
Okay.
So a really small square in the grand scheme of things. And there could be 500,000, 500,000 snails in that one area.
500,000's crazy.
It's so many. What do you think?
I think it's another 1. And hold the womp womp. There's no point in wasting them because we'll just save them for the end. I have nothing good to say about mud snails. If you were listening to this and thought, oh, maybe mud snails will get a high score, I have bad news. It only gets worse from here. They are very small. They are very deserving of a 1. They're about like a 1/4 inch long.
That's pretty small.
It's very small. And like snails are generally small things, but you can see most snails and not mistake them for something.
That's
you
true.
know? That's like half the length of my pinky nail.
And that's their adult size?
That's as big as they get. They do get a little bigger in New Zealand where they're supposed to be, but yeah, I'm very comfortable with the 1. And like I said, hang on, it's not getting better. Next up, we've got accessories. Accessories are those special characteristics that our animal has. You're not going to believe it. I do not score mud snails highly on this, Stephanie.
I'm shocked.
They get a 2 because these tiny little monsters are night hunters.
That sounds pretty cool.
What do they hunt, you ask? Plants.
Oh.
They're essentially small little water cows that only eat at night.
I mean, when you say it like that, it almost sounds kind of cute.
No. Cowards. They're not cute. We haven't got style yet, but I preview. It's not going to be a good score for me on that one either. But they do choose to eat at night to avoid predators. But they're not hunting stuff down. It's just grass, basically.
Yeah, pretty passive way to eat, to be honest.
Really, truly. What did you give them?
So for accessories, I gave New Zealand Mudsnails a 4. A little bit lower than before. And I'm going to talk about their operculum. And
It's about time you came down.
I
truly.
I know. They're cool, but they're not that cool. So on their foot, which is that part of the body that comes out of the shell of a snail, is the operculum. It's almost like a shoe. So
Okay.
kind of a hard plate on the bottom of their foot as they're scooting around. So the operculum is pretty cool because when the snail retracts back up into the shell, when they pull their foot and their head all the way back in, they use that operculum to kind of seal themselves into their shell. So that serves 2 purposes. They're aquatic creatures, right? They live in water. They need water to survive. So when they close themselves off, they keep some of that water inside their shell to stay, to keep the moisture in their body.
Oh, gotcha. So like they could survive out of water for a little bit then.
Exactly. They kind of take their water with them to a point. And the other reason the operculum is really useful is because it seals off the shell from bad things in the environment. So if there's pollution or some kind of chemical in the water, they can seal themselves off and not be exposed to that.
This seems fairly useful. Why'd you only give them a 4?
Well, a lot of snails have operculums. They're not the only ones.
Oh, okay.
So it's not every snail, but a lot of snails do have operculum. So it's not that unique, but it is cool.
Operculum's kind of a fun word to say.
It is fun.
Like rolls off the tongue nicely.
So yeah, 4 for me on accessories. Now let's hitch a ride over to style. Style is how attractive the animal is. Do they have any special colorations or patterns? I'm gonna give them a 3.
Finally, we're getting into the low scores.
Yeah, it's not great. These snails, they're cool, but they're not that unique looking. There's different kinds of snails. So some of them have kind of a more flat whorl, while some of them are more cone-shaped.
Okay.
So New Zealand mudsnails are one of those cone-shaped ones, almost like an ice cream cone, upside down.
Mm-hmm.
So they open on the right. So you know how I talked about that operculum?
Yeah.
That's kind of the opening to their shell. And that's one of the ways that you can tell them apart from other snails. So you have that cone shape and that right hand opening. They also have 5 to 6 whorls. So kind of the swirls on an ice cream cone. Their shell goes around 5 or 6 times.
Okay, and they don't get more whirls like as they get older? It's
Not really.
Like horns or anything like that?
No, that's just kind of their body structure the whole time, as soon as they grow a shell. Sometimes they can have up to 8, but usually it's 5 to 6. And that and their coloration, it can be kind of hard to tell them apart from other snails, but those are the ways to do it.
Okay.
So would you rate them?
Another 1. I'm sticking on the mud snails are awful trade.
Seems like you got beef with mud snails.
As everyone should. and we'll get to what we can do about that beef later. But if you like just search for New Zealand mud snails and you click on the images tab, you're going to get this picture of a dime and what appears to be a bunch of little rocks around it. Nope, those are snails. They don't even look like snails are not the most visually appealing in general, right?
All right. Agree to disagree.
Okay. But there are some like fun looking snails with like big spirals, and it's like, oh wow, that's a snail. You gotta zoom in pretty good on this, and it's next to a dime.
I mean, you said they're really small. They're what, a quarter inch, you said, is adults?
Yeah, but like I was imagining like a very nice world ice cream cone, and instead it's a small pile of rock. And I'm imagining you talked about like 500,000 of them.
Mm-hmm.
It probably just looks like a little pile of rocks.
It can.
This must be like impossible to identify. And
It's just a matter of zoom, Parker. You just gotta look a little closer.
But I'm thinking like, all right, if I had one in my hand, I would think, what a nice little dark rock that I found. I'll put this away because I don't need little dark rocks.
Sure.
I would need some kind of magnification device to be like, oh no, there are 5 to 6 swirls on this little rock.
Yeah, the whirls are a little bit harder to identify in the field, but I think if you find a bunch of what you think are little rocks that look exactly the same, like tiny little ice cream cones, you can probably assume they're not rocks.
Well, anyway, it's a 1. It's hard to tell it's even a snail.
All right.
We're going to move on to intimidation factor.
Okay, before we head over to intimidation factor, I do want to point out, we do call them whirls, not swirls, when we're talking about how many layers of their shell that they have.
They sound the same to me. Say the right one.
Whirls, WHORLS.
And what did I say?
You keep saying swirls.
Oh.
And I get it, the ice cream cone thing. Yeah, I get it. And we are kind of talking about the same shape, but they are called whirls.
Okay. Anyway, moving on to intimidation factor. Intimidation factor is how scary is this animal to other animals or to us? I've been very hard on mud snails this whole podcast.
You have, but rightfully so.
Rightfully so. They're slow, they're ugly, they don't really do anything that's like super cool. They are very intimidating.
How so?
They're just really hard to kill. And when we're talking about invasive species and things that we don't want in our state, generally we're talking about like how can we eliminate these things? And mud snails are just really difficult to kill.
Sure.
So that's going to get them a 9 for intimidation factor.
9's high.
It is. It's more than they deserve, but I'm trying to underscore just how hard it is to get rid of these things. So they can survive in water temperatures up to 95 degrees. It's certainly not like the average temperature of Wyoming waters. They can also survive in water that's salty, like brackish water.
Okay, so like ocean water?
So not like ocean water. That would get them eventually. But like where a river meets the ocean and that like fresh water and salt water mix and it's like kind of salty, kind of fresh,
Okay.
that water they can survive in. And so if they were moving through that, they could use that to get to other places.
I see.
In theory. Very slowly again.
Right.
But this just means that it's really, it's difficult to remove them from somewhere once they've been established.
For sure.
What did you give them?
So I gave mud snails an 8 in intimidation factor.
Okay.
So also pretty high. And they are pretty scary. They're pretty intimidating. For all the reasons you said, they're very hard to get rid of. That operculum really tends to protect them when we're trying to get rid of them. But they also are very scary to other animals. And this can be for a lot of reasons.
Because they're so small. It's unnerving.
I mean, their babies are microscopic, so that is kind of scary that they could be in the water and you wouldn't really know.
Dun, dun.
But they're able to outcompete native snails and other invertebrates that live in their systems.
How do they're certainly not winning races. So like how are they out competing these native invertebrates?
Right, good question. So they're not necessarily winning races, although against other snails, who knows? I don't really run snail races very often, so I couldn't tell you. But what they do is they eat so much because there's so many of them. So we talked a lot about how the mud snails can be in really high densities.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a lot of them in a given space. And when that's the case, they just eat and eat and eat and consume all of the food resources in a system. So other animals don't have anything to eat when there's a bunch of mud snails taking up all that algae, eating all the vegetation that you mentioned earlier.
At night, yeah.
At night, right. They also outcompete other invertebrates just through sheer space. I mean, you need space to live.
Yeah.
So when there's so many snails that they crowd out other animals, there's no place for a native snail to even find food.
Oh, like physically, there's just no space for a snail to like exist.
Exactly. So mud snails, I mean, they can carpet the bottom of streams. You almost can't even see a rock underneath them. It's just like a big pile of snails.
Because they look like rocks, yeah.
They do kind of look like rocks. And that does help them blend in, which is also very scary. But yeah, so their density can be a space issue and it can be a resource issue. Now that we've talked about intimidation factor, it's time for Razzle Dazzle. Razzle Dazzle are those unique features that this animal has that no other animal may have. For mud snails, again, I know I'm rating them maybe higher than they deserve. I'm going to give them an 8.
You're just too much of a snail fan.
I
Even
love
bad
snails. I know, and I don't want to like mud snails, but they're so cool, and just snails in general are great.
Okay, what have they done to deserve this 8?
They have a really unique type of reproduction. So how normally you might need a male and a female snail to make a baby snail. In this case, you only need a female snail because they clone themselves.
I'm sorry, I'm struggling to wrap my head around this. They don't even need 2 snails in theory?
No, it's just one kind of budding off other snails.
So it's not even like you control them by going after male snails only. Because there are no male snails, right?
Well, so yes, in the United States, we only have female mud snails, and they reproduce by cloning themselves into other snails. So it's almost like every snail is the same snail, just a clone of their mother, basically.
That's why they look so uninteresting, is they're all the same snail.
Yeah, there's
they're
not
all
a
the
lot
same
of
pile of
diversity.
rocks.
Yeah.
So how many clones can they produce? Like one?
Mud snails can produce up to 230 clones per year.
Each snail?
Each snail. And that's just the ones that survive. They can actually produce more, but only about 230 of them are going to survive in a given year. So that means that every snail, if they're having 230 clones, each of those 230 clones can have 230 more clones, which
This
means...
is turning into a very hard math problem very quickly.
I know. Don't focus on that. It's just every snail can produce a lot more snails and very quickly. So given this schedule, in just 4 years, one snail can produce 1 billion snails. I'm not kidding. Billion with a B.
Oh my goodness.
That's how they get into such high densities, because one snail produces a bunch more.
Weird.
It is weird. It's kind of like a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, it makes
One
them,
more thing to dislike.
Yeah, it makes them... That kind of helps with the intimidation factor, I think, as well. But how did you rate them?
I'm back to rating them low. They get a 1. A lot of times when we talk about invasives or even just like invertebrates in general, it's like, oh, it's okay. Like mosquitoes. Mosquitoes is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
I don't love mosquitoes around the campfire,
Sure.
but fish like mosquitoes and I like fish. And so there's like this, I like mosquitoes a little bit because fish like them a lot.
Okay, I can see where you're coming from.
There's none of that benefit with mud snails. Fish really can't even properly digest mud snails. So in some systems where there are a lot of mud snails, fish will try to eat them because they're like, this is just like the snails that I normally eat.
Right, and there's a lot of them there.
Yeah, and there's a lot. They're like, what a fortunate thing to happen. There's 1 billion snails where there used to just be a few.
Snail buffet.
Yeah. But because of that operculum that you've mentioned a few times, snails are actually able to like stay intact all the way through the fish's digestive system. And maybe up to 80% of those snails actually just get like pooped out alive.
So you're saying that once they curl up into their shell, that's how they're moving through the fish system.
Yeah. Yeah. They're staying basically sealed off. They're keeping all of that good water in there. And then fish are moving things through their digestive system so fast that they don't even have time to like break down the shell or any other part of the snail.
Like the stomach acid of the fish doesn't even...
No, it doesn't even touch it.
Oh my gosh.
And so you have this potential for maybe even fish to like have snails in their stomach and move and then put those snails somewhere else. And that's another method of transmission maybe.
And since they're alive and you only need one,
Yeah.
start a new whole population.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's really no benefits. There are no like, oh, well, at least fish can eat them. No, fish can't even eat them.
Yeah, I mean, they're at least not getting anything from the snails.
Yeah.
Bummer.
With that, it's time for our wild rating. Just a reminder, our wild rating is the average number of points given for all of our previous categories. Stephanie, can I get a drum roll, please? I do want to take a second before we do the wild rating to recognize that Stephanie is on the podcast, but is still producing. So she's doing the drum roll. She's doing all the little noises. She's doing all the cuts that you don't hear because I messed them up. She's still doing all that stuff, and she's talking. So she's doing a great job.
I'm having a great time.
Incredible. With that, their wild rating,
Wait, Parker, do you mind if I say the wild rating?
please.
Mudsnail's wild rating is 4.5.
Honestly, too high,
Yeah, it is. It's higher than I expected.
but it is still the lowest we've recorded, and that feels
That
good.
feels right.
Yeah.
Definitely the least fun animal that we've done.
No, for sure. Now that we've learned about mud snails, you might want to experience them in nature, but you don't. And Stephanie's going to tell you all the ways that Game and Fish tries to keep mud snails from spreading around the state.
Yes, we definitely do our best. There are populations of mud snails in a handful of Wyoming waters, so you might experience them in nature, but I wouldn't go looking for them because they're not great. We don't want to encourage them to spread around. One of the ways that the Wyoming Game and Fish Department tries to stop the spread of mud snails is through watercraft check stations. So these are places on the side of the highway or at major waters inside the state where we look at all kinds of boats and watercraft. So this includes things like fishing boats, kayaks, paddleboards, rafts. So we inspect all kinds of different things there.
What about like a jet ski?
Yep, we inspect jet skis.
What about like a drift boat that doesn't have a motor?
Absolutely.
What about like a canoe?
Yeah, canoes too.
So like better safe than sorry. If it floats,
If it floats, you should probably get it inspected if you pass an open check station. There's a lot of nuance to this. Inspections, they're kind of hard to navigate sometimes. So check our website for more details and for locations and hours that check stations are open so you can make sure that you're covering your bases. Even if you don't have a boat, you can absolutely help stopping the spread of things like mud snails through practices that we call clean, drain, dry. So it's just like it sounds. It's pretty simple. Just make sure that anything that touches water that you're using, whether it be fishing gear or even just kind of beach toys or whatever is in the water, make sure it's clean. There's no mud or plants on it when you leave the water body. Make sure you drain any water out of whatever you've got, buckets or tackle boxes, if there's water in there. Just make sure it's drained. Make sure everything has time to dry before you move it to another water body. This will really help with stopping the spread of invasive species.
so I guess what does like time to dry look like? Like, is there a specific time frame?
So it kind of depends, but for things like mud snails, it seems long, but about a 30-day dry time is what we recommend.
Is there any way, I'm thinking about like fishing gear. Like if I want to fish one place and then fish in a different place, is there a way I could maybe like speed that up?
Sure. So if dry time is not an option, you can either freeze your waders if you've got like a chest freezer. You can put those in there for like 3 days and just to make sure that everything is dead. And even if you're carrying mud snails and you don't know it, that just make sure that they're not going to be alive by the time that you use that gear again. You can use really, really hot water. That's what we use at check stations. We actually don't use any chemicals when we clean boats, but you have to use really hot water. So hotter than your shower, hotter than that 95 degrees because mud snails can live in that kind of water. So you want to use between 120 and 140 degree water to clean your gear for at least 10 minutes of exposure. Just be careful of protecting your gear when you do this kind of thing. Seals and other kinds of things can be damaged from not cleaning them properly.
Well, I wouldn't say this was the most fun podcast, which means I'm looking forward to next time even more.